middle of it all. We've got Albert Breer joining us from Monday Morning Quarterback. Bert, you could have written about anybody this week with the start of mandatory minicamps, and you chose little old Geno Smith and the Seahawks. How about that?
Yeah, well, I think it's a fascinating story, guys. And I remember talking to Pete Carroll about this, towards the end of last season, and we were talking about examples of players that have had this sort of career arc, and it's hard to find them, and you have to go way back, But I think the ideal is this plays out like Rich Gannon did, a generation ago, or like Jim Plunkett once did, where a guy has an opportunity early in his career. It doesn't work out. He becomes a backup for a while and then reemerges later and, really makes it work, And I think, what's interesting about it is that Geno always saw it coming. And, I know you guys have probably been around him enough to see, like, the confidence he has in himself. And he really did it the right way. And, I think if I'm a Seahawks fan and I look at the way he spent his off season, I think that makes it doubly interesting because, he's still doing all the things that put him in position to have the year that he had last year.
Was it still surreal at times, Bert? Did you still find yourself like, am I really going to write this about Geno Smith? I think because Salk and I, go ahead.
It's weird because our last big memory of him before this was him getting taking a roundhouse in the Jets locker room in whatever it was, 2015. And I think I would say it takes, a certain mental toughness, a certain discipline to be able to come back from something like that. And look, I think it's a good lesson too on the fact that you never live down where you're drafted. Guys who are first round picks generally get chance after chance after chance, right? Like Sam Darnold, for example, got a second chance in Carolina. Baker Mayfield got a second chance in Carolina. Josh Rosen got a second chance in Miami, where those guys got a shot to be starting quarterbacks again, and, Geno, by virtue of where he was drafted going in the second round, wasn't going to just, get that opportunity to start automatically somewhere else, and somebody trying to perform like a reclamation project on him. And so, I think for a guy like that who's, drafted in the second round, it actually probably takes more discipline because you don't know when that next shot's going to come, and you have to be ready for it when it does come. And, very clearly he was ready for his opportunity when it came along.
What did you learn in talking to him?
I mean, I just think the drive, I guess that was the main thing. The whole premise for the story, I got on the phone with him and I sort of didn't know where it would go. And the first thing I did was I said to him, Geno, I want to kind of lay out your off season and how you're planning on building on all of this. And so let's go back to you guys getting eliminated by the Niners in the playoffs. I'm assuming you took some time to decompress after that and kind of take stock of everything. And he stopped me. He's like, no, I didn't, and he was the only player, I think, one of the only players that stayed behind in Seattle, after they lost the playoffs, outside of the guys who were rehabbing from injuries, and wanted to get a couple of weeks in with the strength coaches to, rework, some things with his core and everything else. And then from there, it was right into throwing. And so, I think where a lot of players would take that time to decompress, he wanted to build on the momentum that he had, that he had built over the course of his, first full season starting in, I think it was 8 years. And then, I think, you sort of look at, how that's rubbed off on some of his teammates. There's a lot of reasons to be optimistic about where he's going. And, I think part of it too is the group the Seahawks have coming back. And, that group of second-year players that look like they might be the foundation for a lot of things going forward.
Could you write this piece for the Monday Morning Quarterback and spend all the time you did researching it and talking to all the people involved in it without associating Russell Wilson?
It's hard not to, right, I guess. They were careful. I mean, the people I talked to were careful. But, I mean, look, there's definitely I would say a juxtaposition. I thought what was so interesting about it, Brock, was I mean, did you guys know about all this work he was doing? No, right?
Well, I had seen some of the videos from his production company that he carried around to all. Oh, I'm sorry, he didn't do any of that.
He goes north to south Empire.
Sorry, that's a different quarterback. You know what? I got confused on that. That's my bad.
I mean, that's the thing, though, right? I was surprised about all this. I hadn't heard about all this because Geno didn't care to tell anybody, right? And if Russ was doing this, we would have gotten a video from the Seahawks weight room in January, right? Some highly produced video. And everybody does things their own way, but I think it's sort of interesting. And I think it probably, honestly, guys, probably goes a long way in explaining why his teammates have such great respect for him, because he's not putting himself out front publicly of all these things, but privately he's very much leading the way, and so again, I don't know whether or not he's going to be the quarterback of the Seahawks for the next 5 years. But I think he's doing a lot of the right things to put him in position to have that shot.
One of the lines that really stuck with me, and I sat there thinking, processing it, and whether or not it was true or am I of that opinion, it was his QB coach, who obviously is biased, but he's a pretty renowned guy that works with a lot of different quarterbacks and ascending quarterbacks. And he said if Geno Smith was 24, the NFL world would view him as a top 5 quarterback. You agree with that?
I mean, I put that question to Quincy because I do think a lot of these things, Brock, are colored by perception, right? And I mean, just forget the ranking. How would you guys look at Geno if he was part of that draft class? So let's just say instead of him being 31 years old last year, let's say he's part of that draft class. How do you look at the way he played?
Right, I mean,
without your preconceived notions.
Right, it'd be hard not to say that this draft class was as good as anyone had ever had to be on that list.
Yeah, I mean, so that's the thing is I think a lot of this is colored by perception, and of course it's different, because if you've got a quarterback who's 23 years old, then you've got potentially 15 years of runway with the guy, so you don't have that. But I mean, the dynamics have changed at that position. You can't hit him the same way you used to be able to hit him. Sports science has certainly made advances. So, I don't see why you wouldn't look at a guy who's going to be 32, I believe, as somebody who could be a quarterback for the next 5 or 6 years and be, very much like what Alex Smith was in Kansas City, right? Where Alex Smith got there with Andy Reid and gave them 5 really good years and bridged them to Patrick Mahomes, and they made the playoffs consistently and allowed them to build the team up. And I think, if you do go back and you look at it and you look at the circumstances he was under in New York, they weren't great, I just, and I think that's something that gets lost a lot too. There are a lot of young quarterbacks that, through no fault of their own, go through a lot of bad circumstances. The GM and coach that drafted Geno, and if you guys really want to go back and look at this, there was enormous disagreement over whether to play him between the head coach and general manager. And then both those guys wound up getting fired and the new guys come in and they inherit him. And then the punch happens. And then, Ryan Fitzpatrick plays great. I mean, if you go back and you look at it, the pathway to Geno making it in New York was actually pretty narrow, and he didn't make it. And so I just think a lot of times, perception can color these things. And we don't look at each guy's circumstances, I actually kind of went back and looked at this, in a column that's going up today. And, in the 19, 20, and 21 draft classes, 12 quarterbacks were drafted in the first round. So in those 3 classes, right, 12 quarterbacks drafted in the first round. There's only one of those 12, and this is young guys, who still has the same head coach and offensive coordinator he did when he was drafted, and that's Joe Burrow. He's the only one. So, a lot of times circumstances can affect where these guys go.
Talking to Albert Breer here on Seattle Sports, he wrote about Geno Smith. And while this is a story about Geno Smith, to me, the whole Geno Smith story is also about Pete Carroll. And we were talking a little bit about this earlier. What did I learn last year? That Pete wasn't holding Russell Wilson back. In fact, he was bringing out the best in Russell Wilson and maybe even finding ways to minimize Russell's worst tendencies. And a year later, I think I have to say he's done the same with Geno, that he has found a way to bring out his best qualities. And isn't that exactly what a head coach is supposed to do with his best players?
Yeah, and I think like Geno's in a better position to appreciate the opportunity that's in front of him now and value the opportunity that's in front of him. I mean, I think one thing about Russ, he became such a big star so quickly. You know what I mean? Like all of that happened so fast. And I think that definitely had an effect on it. You know, all of a sudden you've got all these opportunities in front of you. Like Geno, like I think Geno's going to have a better appreciation of what's in front of him, better perspective, you know, and certainly they got the most out of him. Yeah, I mean, like how differently do we look at Shane Waldron now than we did last year, you know? Yeah, I think you can look at like a lot of people in that building a lot differently. And, you know, I've always thought like Pete's got a really good sense for people, like really, really great emotional intelligence, right? Like, so he understands what makes people tick, how to get the most out of people. And I think schematically too, you know, you see some of the things that they were able to do for Geno to get him going sort of dovetails with, I think, the fact that, like, they knew what was best for Russ all along. And when Russ finally got what he wanted, which, like, play me like I'm Peyton Manning, play me like I'm Tom Brady, how did that look? Right? Like, Denver gave him what he wanted. And now, you know, a year later, Sean Payton's coming in there, and Sean Payton's going to be hard on him. And Sean Payton's not going to do things the way that Russell Wilson is, you know, like he's not gonna follow directions on the way to run his offense, you know. So I think it's a great lesson in getting the most out of players, and even to some degree with some quarterbacks, like the way they want to do things isn't always what's best for them or their skill set.
Last thing for me here, Bert, if you had to invest and buy stock into Russ or Geno in 2023, who are you invested in?
That's a tough question. I would say Geno because I think Geno's like in a more stable situation right now, and the team is more invested in him. And that sounds weird because Russell's got the huge contract, and the Seahawks can get out of this contract after a year, and the Broncos would have a really hard time getting out of that contract after this year. I would not ignore the signing of Jarrett Stidham in Denver, and I know that sounds crazy, but they gave him $5 million a year. And I think to some degree for Sean Payton, like Jarrett Stidham's going to be like a baseline. Like, look what I can do with Jarrett Stidham, right? Like in preseason games and practice, look what I can do with Jarrett Stidham. So you better be on it, Russell, because if you don't, I'm not afraid to walk away from you. You know, and again, I know it sounds crazy because Jarrett Stidham's been a backup for his 4 years in the league. But I do think that was kind of an under-the-radar signing that should not be ignored. And I think that, like, you know, I think, and you've seen it since the start. I mean, you saw a look on Sean Payton's face when he said whatever it was, like that he's not familiar with with the idea of the quarterback having an office in the building, right? You know, I think there's definitely a new sheriff there in Denver, and you know, I think it's Sean Payton's show there where. I think in Seattle, there's much more of a partnership between team and player at this point, which again sounds wild. If you think if I had told you that a year ago, you would have, you know, you would never have me on again, right? Like that would happen. But that's the way it's played out.
Don't be silly. I'm sure you've said sillier things in your life than
and we would have you on,
of course
Bert.
We'd have you on.
I have sworn on you.
Right, that's true. Yeah. So might as well be Florida. I think I heard from you at some point.